Ginger Alden was a wide-eyed young girl from a small town in Tennessee who was both frightened and flattered to be introduced to her lifelong idol, Elvis Presley. And it turned into a fairy tale romance.
The news of a revelation no one expected has sent shockwaves throughout the fandom of Elvis Presley and even those in his family. She willfully sat in silence for years about her unbelievable story. However, this historic truth, so shocking that even the immediate family of Elvis could never have imagined it would come out, can now be told. For more than 40 years, the world had accepted what it thought to be the final end of Elvis's fantastic story. But Ginger's statement adds a new chapter to the story. This information is beyond the word groundbreaking. It will change the way you see the icon. But who exactly was this woman trusted with Elvis's heart in his final days, and why has Who was Ginger Alden, anyway, and what is her true story? Behind the glitzy and glamorous doors of Graceland, Elvis Presley's iconic home, Ginger Alden was faced with a reality that was far from the public's often romanticized and superficial perception of the life of the great vocalist. At the young age of just 20 years old, she found herself thrust into a very unusual and somewhat unconventional role, not merely acting as Elvis's mistress, but instead having the rare and distinct honor of being chosen by him as his fiancée, hand-picked to be the one who would share and participate in what would be the next significant chapter of his life's path. Their profound and intense bond, however, was far from the shallow and temporary link that is so often associated with most celebrity couplings, but rather one filled with a deep richness that made their coming together one of a kind special. Instead of being nurtured in the harsh glare and blinding light of public attention, their romance developed and took root in those quiet moments that existed between their acts, far from the prying eyes of loyal followers and the ever-watchful eye of the paparazzi. It was during these quiet and still hours, perhaps most notably during the profound early morning quiet that blankets the world around us, that Elvis was available to those who understood the depths beneath his facade in a way that few people did, or perhaps even appreciated. At precisely 3:00 a.m., as though conditioned, he would casually walk the vacant and still hallways of Graceland, completely naked, deeply immersed in heavy introspection that consumed his thoughts. His softly spoken confessions, spoken barely audible but weighed down by emotion, betrayed the considerable weight of his affliction. Not only the overwhelming feeling of repression that stemmed from the external pressures brought to bear against him, but also the revelation of the heavy veil that the world required of him at all times in order to satisfy its expectations. During those weakest moments when he was overwhelmed by overwhelming feelings, he would ask himself a set of deep, introspective questions, such as, what if I were to simply run away from all of my problems and the mess that surrounds me? Or what if I were to simply disappear entirely into nothingness, go missing so thoroughly that no one would ever miss me or even notice that I was gone? Notice that these were not fantasies swirling about his head, but were rather actual and sincere wishes for an escape, a desire to get away from all of the weights overwhelming him. His interest in religious rebirth and reincarnation became stronger with his voracious reading inclinations. He viewed his legacy as a blessing, but a smothering burden otherwise. In one truly insightful discussion, he shared with Ginger a deep secret. Fame, he said, is the loveliest jail you'll ever see. The rumors persisted, shards of unorthodox notions in pursuit of rebuilding, looking for a refuge where anonymity would be at hand, and remaking his self from his mythical image. While Ginger herself was left uncertain and somewhat conflicted as to whether Elvis was seriously entertaining the possibility of escape or simply testing the limits of her commitment to him, the unwavering fire and passion that blazed in his eyes irrevocably convinced her that this was no fantasy or fleeting whim. What pulled her even deeper into the late-night conversations, fraught with tension and suspense, was his intriguing suggestion of the utilization of a hand. A person who existed outside of the Graceland bubble of familiarity. Someone who had the necessary expertise and skills to coordinate and execute an escape plan, such as the one under discussion. The question here is this: were these just the disjointed thoughts and ravings of a tired and exhausted mind in the late hours of the night, or was it really America's most famous and renowned entertainer, Elvis Presley, who was seriously plotting a course for what would have quite possibly been the most hotly contested and controversial disappearing act in the history of modern times? Also, if that was so, how close did he really get to accomplishing and carrying out this grandiose plan? But what if those late-night whispers were not the ramblings of a restless soul, but the final blueprint of a man preparing to vanish? And if so, what signs did Ginger see that no one else dared to confront? The strange behavior no one wanted to talk about. In their last few weeks together, Ginger witnessed an extraordinary transformation in Elvis, one that went far beyond his physical frame. Although there were certainly moments when he seemed especially tired or emotionally withdrawn, the actual shift was expressed most profoundly at the very core of his inner energy. An energy so genuine and profound that it vibrated throughout every corner of his existence. His face had grown more thoughtful and determined-looking, as though he was counting down in some systematic manner towards a predetermined goal. The precise nature of this goal was not yet apparent. His own small talk each day was changed in a breathtakingly dramatic fashion that came as a shock to most individuals. He completely ceased discussing his work on an everyday basis. Things such as the recording sessions, the upcoming concerts, and the relentless stream of public appearances that had made up the fabric of his life for decades. Instead, he was preoccupied with more profound issues of reconstruction and renewal, taking refuge in the idea of escaping the suffocating stresses that had long accompanied being a legend. At one of those moments when their connection felt especially close and private, he leaned in nearer to Ginger and shared with her in a tone that was heavy with unspoken confidence. "Maybe someday I'll wake up in a world where I can sense the safety of anonymity surrounding me everywhere." And then continued with words that appeared to capture at once a feeling of wistfulness and a lightness of heart. "Where they don't know me as the king." Far from sad, however, his tone had an implacable edge of rescue as he set about the diligent process of personal organization. He started to collect beloved mementos, tattered photos full of memories of past days, handwritten letters from close friends and family members, and numerous precious trinkets that spoke of his journey. Ginger observed with increasing curiosity as he inserted specific papers into envelopes and arranged them with careful intention. There had passed many nights when he was bound to the phone for what felt like an eternity, his throat raw and strained from the constant dialogues echoing behind the shut door of his own private sanctuary. When asked about the identities of these midnight callers, he would merely nod in a sign of understanding and respond in a carefully obtuse tone, "Just someone helping me to define the road better ahead." At first, Ginger had attributed all these occurrences and changes that were going on to a period of preparation for a temporary break, or perhaps even the start of another creative endeavor that required his creative skill set. But as weeks passed and the time dragged on, this feeling started building up, becoming more apparent. It was not only a pause in his flawless career, it was something much deeper and more substantial than that. The question hung in her mind nearly always, a shadow across her thoughts. Was Elvis working on yet another dazzling and highly publicized comeback to resuscitate his career? Or was he perhaps taking a step towards something that might be viewed as far more final and conclusive? There was an unavoidable aura of suspense that surrounded her, much like the wonderful fragrance of the magnolias. Those flowers were beautiful and sweet, but they also had about them a hint of sadness that spoke of more profound feelings. This fragrance promised that change was coming, but it was uncertain what the ultimate result would finally be. A letter hidden from the world. Years following the premature demise of the iconic Elvis Presley, talented and determined. Ginger Alden stumbled upon a discovery that would transform her life forever in a radical way. The world-shattering discovery was based on a deeply personal item that was concealed among the treasured belongings of the great artist, which was highly valuable and meaningful. The startling discovery came in the form of a secret drawer that, as Ginger revealed, she was the sole individual to have ever opened during Elvis's lifetime. The topic at hand was of a very personal nature, a letter penned by hand, and one that was different from other typical legal documents or business letters. Very different from the myriad number of letters Elvis had penned to individuals like his lawyers, managers, family members, or girlfriends. This letter stood as an isolated example of simplicity with an air of secrecy about it. The physical presence of the letter fell short of conveying the enormous emotional heft it bore within its brief frame. Though brief in its physical presence, each and every word that had been painstakingly and purposefully put down on paper carried a depth of meaning that was astoundingly profound. Rather than pointing fingers at particular individuals or making a list of names, Elvis chose deliberately to expose the depths of his innermost pain. With his considerate articulation, he created a vivid picture of the relationships that had moved from a space of profound, meaningful connection to a space of mere transactional exchange without the benefit of warmth and genuine feeling. He spoke with great eloquence about how certain individuals in his life had repeatedly taken more and more from him, leaving him drained and severely depleted. Of all that was said, the most powerful and compelling portion was, without a doubt, Elvis's poetic description of his own life. A life he painted as one without control. He perceived himself as a prisoner, trapped in a reality that was neither built nor developed by him, but rather one that was constructed, a body that existed in a mechanized manner, and an inheritance that was determined by the actions and behaviors of others. As time went on, he felt his own voice growing weaker, more brittle with each passing day. His lyrical prose, at times emotional and raw with vulnerability, tended to break down into fragments, like song lyrics that, regretfully, would never find their way into any song. There was one sentence that was particularly haunting and isolating, deceptively simple in its wording but so very evocative. "I feel as though I am living a life that really belongs to someone else." What struck Ginger Alden the most was not the message itself, but the very specific manner in which it was spoken and articulated. There was no hint of any kind of fierce anger or fury anywhere in the words. There was, instead, a profound and moving resignation that seemed to be almost otherworldly, as though it was beyond normal emotions. The letter was not an ordinary letter. Instead, it was far deeper, an articulation of a gentle and loving farewell to a world which had, from the very beginning, never truly given him the room to breathe and live to full capacity. She returned to the letter again and again throughout the rest of her life, finding new levels of meaning in it each time that spoke to her in a different way on each reading, in the choice of a particular word, a contemplative pause, or a devastating turn of phrase she had not seen before. Yet, however often she returned to the letter, there was always one fundamental question that continued to draw her attention. Why would a man who was at the peak of success on the world stage choose to write a letter that so clearly read like a farewell? A final night full of signs. That night changed history and was permanently etched inside Ginger's brain. Elvis presented more razzle-dazzle energy than usual, projecting that he was different, that he could care even less, as if he had morphed into a total schmuck, controlled by the primal beast within his victim's swirling eyes, contained by other veils held motionless, and they just paid for the fake making of the real act previously described. That evening, his discussion took a different course, diverting away from the world of generalized hopes and aspirations and gliding purposefully towards concrete and carefully planned goals. He started speaking with an astounding degree of specificity about some of the projects he could potentially work on in the future, having a discussion about real strategies instead of mulling over pure abstract possibilities that were without substance. In this conversation, it was easy to feel the tension, especially when he told Ginger to prepare a plain suitcase with no incredible or elaborate reason for this strange situation. While Elvis gave these bizarre orders, he had his customary half-joking manner that was uniquely Elvis. A truly unique expression came over his face when he expected the matter to be kept confidential, although it didn't seem to be particularly firm or threatening. "We're going to take quite an extraordinary trip," he remarked slowly, allowing the words to linger in the air like an enticing promise that had yet to be fully made. Throughout the evening, Elvis spent a great deal of his time involving himself in a plethora of philosophical and religious writings, his hands moving in a slow and reflective fashion as he jotted down astute comments in the margins of these meditative tomes. The pages of paper that lay around him in his workspace were scattered haphazardly, crammed with quickly written words and phrases that seemed to hold a profound and specific meaning for him. Down the door, he was taking particular care to place a grouping of unrelated items into a deliberate and thoughtful arrangement, creating a tidy pile that gave a strong indication of expectation of a near departure, not driven by any feeling of fear, but rather born of a state of cautious and studious preparation. Occasionally, a soft and calming humming melody would elegantly escape his lips as he subtly made refined adjustments in his immediate surroundings and the world around him. But in a sudden twist of fate, without any warning, his attitude took a drastic change. His movements solidified into a greater purpose and clearly delineated intent, confirmed by the way he began to focus a little more comparably seriously as he uniquely turned to Ginger, giving her a look that was as solemn and serious as the circumstance called for. "I have one thing to do yet," he panted with the same breathless intonation. His whisper was so faint, it was next to imperceptible, but his emphasis was quite simply impossible to dismiss. The words still lingered in the air like some ghostly refrain as he began making his slow and measured way along the long Graceland corridor, slowly fading into the surrounding darkness that closed in around him. Ginger was utterly still, her body totally immobilized in a moment that was not unlike being in suspended animation, as an unexplainable and oppressive feeling of weight bore down upon her chest. The silence that filled the room afterward was oppressively stifling, heavily weighted with the myriad unasked questions that hung ponderously in the air. What on earth could this mysterious assignment be? And why had this goodbye, which had been said in such an unconventional way as to not actually seem like one at all, affected her so deeply and profoundly at her very core? But was that breathless farewell a cryptic warning, a secret passed in code, one last message only Ginger was meant to receive? And when the morning came, why did everything feel wrong? The moment that still haunts her. It was hours before Ginger finally awoke from her long slumber and was confronted with a creepy atmosphere that covered all of the rooms in her home. The clock was 7:50, but it wasn't just the time that was askew. The entire space felt distorted. The familiar configuration of the world was not shifted, but seemed altered, as if it were a ripple in water. Her gaze instinctively swept the room for Elvis, but his usual spot was vacant. The precision of his daily routine, those comforting routines he followed with metronomic regularity, had been disrupted. The house was thick with an unspoken tension, its air fattened like thickening honey. The lights he always left burning were out and unresponsive, plunging the rooms into a false darkness. His favorite armchair sat empty, a reminder of his absence, and his belongings retained their precise position but somehow remained frozen in time. Walking through the room, the atmosphere clung to her skin like a wet mist. Something fundamental had shifted, leaving a space that vibrated through every atom. The quiet was absolute, as if time itself had lost a beat and frozen. Her own breath remained in her throat, but panic had not appeared yet. She looked about in an organized manner for any evidence of chaos, but there was none. No couches knocked over, no desperate messages written on torn pieces of paper, no fading hums of hasty departure. The emptiness enfolded her like a cloak, pressing upon her skin. She walked through the empty halls, footsteps hollow and echoing off walls that seemed to close in upon her with growing need. The silence grew heavier, punctuated only by the creak of old crumbled wood beneath her feet. She called out softly, half expecting his voice to slice from another room, but the only echo was the obstinate quiet. What struck her as most unusual wasn't the vanishing itself, but the complete absence of reaction on the part of those around her. No questioning glances, no questioning comments, no apparent concern. Daily routines continued unabated, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. This collective indifference upset her more than the vanishing. Years would pass before she could properly put into words that feeling. But even now, she could not dispel the sense that she walked in a dream. The quiet was still there, a living presence that wrapped around her ankles, slowing her steps. She glided from room to room, half expecting his voice to echo along the corridors, calling her back with its familiar warmth. But the quiet was stubborn, unyielding to reality. The more she struggled to comprehend that moment, the more ephemeral comprehension became. Time wrapped back upon itself, forming memory pockets that would not align. Even now, all these years later, she remembered that strange stillness as an enigma, not a loss. It haunted her mind like the ghost of a sunrise, a promise of dawn that never quite came. And she couldn't shake the creepy feeling that what she'd just witnessed wasn't an ending, but the beginning of something illicit. Something that she was the only one who had witnessed come into action. The silence that followed. When Elvis Presley suddenly and untimely passed away, Ginger Alden found herself faced with an abrupt and extreme shift in her own life. The world she had known, a world of love and welcoming from the close-knit Presley family, began to alter drastically in ways she could never have foreseen. The friendly and affectionate bond she had shared with Elvis's family gradually began to cool, morphing into a very palpable feeling of tension and distance that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Conversations that once flowed so easily and freely prior to this, filled with laughter and interaction, were now strained and short, and often broken by uncomfortable silences that hung in the air like a thick blanket in the room. Eye contact, which was once warm, frequent, and connecting, was now occurring less often and was shorter, as people were doing everything they could to look anywhere but at her. Shockingly, no one came to her with concern and compassion, and nobody volunteered to ask her how she was, nor did they ask for her side of Elvis's last hours before he died. It seemed as though the things that happened and the feelings that were experienced during the time frame in which Elvis was approaching the latter stages of his life were too fragile, too complex, and too overwhelming for anyone to freely and openly discuss. As the press descended upon Memphis, Ginger found herself coming under greater pressure to be silent. When she attempted to speak guardedly and with respect, her words were frequently distorted, taken out of context, or just ignored. The world, reeling still from its sorrow at the death of its legendary hero, began taking her as a willing target for its anger and despondency. Without ever having an opportunity to hear her side of the story or view her perspective, she became the unintentional scapegoat of the disorderly days that followed Elvis's death. Confronted with the overwhelming sense of isolation and perplexity regarding her situation, Ginger opted to do what she believed was the only reasonable thing available to her. She stepped away from the public eye entirely. Though she always liked to remain quiet and low-key in public, in the privacy of her own soul and mind, she held close and treasured those uniquely valuable moments that mattered the most to her. Elvis's sincerity-filled letters in which he professed to her the intensity of his love for her, the moving final words he had spoken to her, and the strange but meaningful instructions he had left for her throughout their final night together. All these treasured moments still remained very vividly etched in her mind, so much so that they would definitely endure and never be erased with the passage of time. Even though Ginger possessed information that had the potential to be very profitable, She did not use her inside information for her own benefit. She resolutely resisted the temptation that beckoned to her to pen scandalized memoirs or to seek aggressively after headlines, which, had she sought them, could have won for her a vast fortune. Rather, she stood firm and unmoving as a modest sentinel of fact, carrying with courage and dignity the weighty burden of what had come upon her in her life. As the years stacked one on top of the other, the weight of her long-held unsaid history grew increasingly heavier and more difficult to bear for her, until finally, after suffering through generations of silence and keeping it all locked away inside of her, she is ready and willing to share her real story with the world for the first time. Her confession changes everything. In a shocking disclosure that would shatter the history of rock and roll, Ginger Alden made a phenomenal revelation in a private, personal interview. This astonishing secret, hidden for more than 4 decades, was presented with calculated understatement rather than dramatic flair. Like someone finally releasing a breath hidden for years, her words communicated an undeniable gravity despite their subdued delivery. Elvis Presley's final days, as sketched in Alden's testimony, were marked by a radical shift of emphasis. Far from preparing for a triumphant return to the spotlight or meticulously plotting concert schedules, he had a far more radical vision in mind. His goal lay outside the realm of show business, constituting nothing less than a complete overhaul of his existence. The king of rock and roll, Alden revealed, was contemplating a record-breaking escape, not from death, but from fame itself. He wished to break free from the suffocating expectations that had dogged him since his early days, to rid himself of the crushing weight of his iconic status. This was not a desperate retreat driven by fear, but a calculated move towards freedom, driven by a desire to transcend the very legacy that had come to define him. Alden illustrated Elvis not as a broken man succumbing to destiny, but as a determined man creating his own destiny. He portrayed someone who appeared to possess a distinctive awareness and sensibility, suggesting someone who had thought through everything he might want to do in the future. The mechanisms were available, the resolve was unwavering, and subtle hints had been strategically placed along the way, but never enough to paint the whole picture. Although Alden never uttered the word faked, her conviction and poise spoke volumes. Her confidence was palpable, conveyed both through her even tone and peaceful countenance. Was it possible that Elvis Presley had achieved musical history's most enigmatic departure? The implications were staggering, defying all that the world understood of rock's greatest legend's last act. But if Ginger quietly hinted at a rewritten ending, what did Priscilla know? And why did she choose to guard her silence so fiercely, even as the truth edged closer to the surface? Her legacy rewritten. Priscilla Presley's remarkable life story serves as an enduring testament to her steadfast sense of dignity and loyalty. Unlike the vast majority of those thrust into the public eye who seek out all the attention and fame, she made a conscious decision to take a course of action that would involve purposeful escape. That would be any attempt to cash in on her remarkable association with the world of rock and roll royalty. The silence she maintained all her life was not the result of fear or intimidation, but a natural extension of a deeper and stronger conviction that some personal aspects of life are deserving of being protected and need to be concealed from the hungry gaze of the public eye. As the seasons of remembrance have matured and increased with the years, Priscilla stands with the weight of an ever heavier burden upon her shoulders, a burden comprised of the amassed knowledge of untold and countless truths. Her choice to speak at last now, however, is not one that arrives in either the fanfare of theatrics or publicity stunt calculations carefully crafted to solicit attention. Rather, It issues from her as a quiet sorrow, a profound sadness born of watching someone you love incredibly make the excruciating decision to choose disappearance and silence over the potential devastation that could be ushered in by the ruthless spotlight and relentless scrutiny of fame. Although there are still some secrets that remain tightly locked behind closed doors, Priscilla's carefully selected words, tone, and impeccably timed delivery have managed to surprisingly open up previously sealed doors of information. This case presents us with a set of intriguing possibilities. Did Elvis Presley, the iconic figure we all know, stage his own departure from the suffocating pressures of fame? Did he intentionally fade away into complete obscurity, leaving only one loyal friend to be privy to the entire truth of the matter? The intrigue of this leaves much room for speculation. What do you believe transpired in this fascinating scenario yourself? We welcome you to voice your thoughts and opinions in the comment section below.